Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In this video, I'm going to answer a question that a student had in wanting an explanation or description of the four parts or the different parts components of an exercise. In other words, the repetition. So when you do a repetition, you move your limbs in one direction, you stop, and then you go and you move the opposite direction, you stop, and you do that back and forth, right? So that's a repetition. The general understanding is that a repetition, a single repetition in any exercise you ever do, has at least three contractions, and in some cases, four contractions. So we generally talk about the four sort of components or four phases of a repetition. And why is this important? Because understanding each of those phases, the tension development that's created during each of those phases will help you to decide from a programming perspective how to perform the exercise, the amount of time you're going to keep the muscle under tension through these different phases or components. And more important than anything else is the safety aspect. Remember, personal trainers, more than anything, because we deal with average, apparently healthy people, whether they are super fit or not, they're still, if they're not athletes, they are average, apparently healthy people. And therefore, safety becomes of critical importance. In other words, even though certain exercises we know for sure can provide tremendous benefit in either strength, power, hypertrophy, or muscular endurance, we will not either do the exercise or do it in such a way that compromises the safety of the individual's joint integrity or the muscle soft tissue itself. So they've got to understand that first and foremost, before we do anything, is that we are concerned about safety. Now, when I trained athletes, for instance, of course I was concerned with safety, but that balancing act between safety and risk of an exercise, I had to err on the side of getting more bang for my buck. So I would take more risks, i.e., with their bodies, meaning from an injury perspective, doing certain plyometric type of exercises, ballistic type movements, heavy training for power and for, in some cases, strength. That's a trade-off because the heavier I would go with the weights, and which were necessary to get the requisite outcome, the greater the risk for injury, right? As a personal fitness trainer, I don't worry about that so much because my biggest concern is that my client doesn't get injured. And I can progressively add more resistance, more repetitions as time goes on, as they adapt to the training. So I just want to make sure that you understand that. As personal fitness trainers, our goal is not to do singles and triples with people and max out their deadlift. Okay, that's ridiculous, to be honest with you, because I don't do, first of all, I don't do deadlifts with any athletes. And I would never do them with the average client. I'm talking about regular deadlifts. You see, I'm thinking safety more than anything else. So understanding the components, now I'm putting up four fingers because I'm going to go through this with you. Not every exercise provides tension, and this is just pure biomechanics. Not every exercise at every point in the movement provides tension, and I'll give you some examples in a minute. So the four parts of the repetition, we have two movement phases, we call those, the concentric and the eccentric. You know them for sure as the positive and the negative. And we're talking about standard common exercises from dumbbell curls to squats. So we have these two movement phases in a repetition, right? A repetition is a single sequence of all three or four components of the exercise. So when I go down and back up and then back down, that's a single repetition. And that involves a concentric or the positive when the muscle is shortening under tension, the eccentric or what we call the negative, where the muscle is lengthening under tension, right? By the way, that's the definition of a contraction. A muscle contraction involves the development of tension. Okay. You can watch the other videos that I've done related to what causes tension, or you can even put the question in the comment box and I'll get to that and answer that question for you as well in another video. So you have the concentric, eccentric, positive, negative, and then you have these two, one for sure, but in some cases, two what are known as isometric contractions. Now, just got to be careful in explaining this. When I say an isometric contraction, I'm simply talking about when the muscle is not changing length, but still maintains some level of tension. Okay, and I'll give you the demonstrations here in a couple exercises. So the concentric muscle is shortening, eccentric muscle is lengthening. Isometric contractions simply means that the muscle has paused, but still maintains tension. Now we see two of those at the point of change in direction from the concentric to the eccentric and from the eccentric to the concentric. Let me give you the first example, a dumbbell curl. I'm just going to use my one arm. I'm holding a 10, 15, whatever, pound dumbbell. Whatever it is providing enough tension on my bicep, right, to create whatever outcome I'm looking for, endurance, strength, whatever. So the four components of the repetition in a dumbbell curl, again, depending on where I'm starting the movement, it's not going to matter. But I'm going to go ahead and say that we pull the dumbbells off the rack and you hold it with the arm extended at the bottom position. This is my start position. I know some people that start up here and they go 1, 2. I don't care. It doesn't really matter because we're not talking about proper performance in that sense. But if I start with the dumbbell at the bottom and I go up and down, that's 1 rep. You got that? I start here with a 25-pound dumbbell. I go up and I go down. That's a single rep. Why? Because I have the 2 movement phases, the up, right? My muscle is shortening under tension, and that's called the concentric. When my bicep then lengthens under tension, i.e. through what's known as the eccentric contraction, right? My muscle is essentially slowing down the movement, right? That's a movement phase. Muscle is lengthening under tension. But you'll notice that the change in direction from the concentric to the eccentric, or the positive to the negative, occurs at the top of the movement. So I'm movement, stop, and then movement down. Then I stop. It's at these 2 points up here, what we call, in this case, the peak contraction, and down here, the stretch or the elongated position. Both of those are isometric contractions, or at least one is for sure. The lengthened position for sure is going to be under tension, as long as you don't lock your elbow out and keep your arm straight down. But generally, there's always going to be some tension when my muscle lengthens through the eccentric and I get to this bottom portion. That is an isometric contraction. Does that make sense? Now, in a dumbbell curl, for instance, there is this top position known as the peak contraction. Now, you tell me, what do you normally do, and what do you see most people normally do at the very top position of a dumbbell curl? Exactly. You probably just did it yourself. You went, you squeeze it at the top. I've been doing this, I don't know, 35 years, 40 years or something like that. And I never do a squeeze at the top. Never did, still would not do it. I might occasionally, just for fun, but I'm not doing it for any real physiological benefit or outcome. Doug, what are you talking about? The peak contraction, that's what builds the peak. All right, you might as well just go off and watch another video if you think that squeezing your bicep in the top position literally does anything to the bicep, let alone change the shape of it. Well, that's why we talk about exercise science, which is actually what is correct. Ladies and gentlemen, understand something. The most effective point of a contraction is not in a dumbbell curl at the top. It's at the bottom. Why? Because if you understand muscle physiology, you do understand that as the actin and myosin filaments within what we call the sarcomere, they actually increase their total capability for what are known as cross bridges. Cross bridging is what creates the tension in a muscle, ultimately a muscle fiber, i.e. the sarcomere, right? And then ultimately in the entire muscle fiber. That's where tension is created between the heads of the myosin and the actin filaments. And so if we are looking scientifically, if we are looking to increase or generate the highest level of actual second by second, minute by minute levels of tension, you would put the muscle at a lengthened position with a relatively higher level of load. I hope that makes sense. I know what most of you are thinking. Man, I've been doing that my whole life. I come up and I squeeze at the top and I supinate my wrist and I do all this and I go, look, do whatever you want to do, but it's a waste of your time. Why? Because in the peak contraction, the total percentage of cross bridging that occurs is actually reduced. You actually limit the cross bridging potential and percentage of cross bridges that can occur in all of the muscle fibers in your bicep. In other words, what I always tell trainers is think of the meat and potatoes. Where are you getting the most tension development? It's through the eccentric into the lengthened or stretched isometric. Now, I've had other students then tell me, well, should I just do negative only training? And the answer to that is no, because that is not the end of the conversation. The concentric component or the shortening phase of the repetition has extreme value. It's just you don't need to waste your time at the very top of a repetition and squeeze it. So the general recommendation that I always give is that in a exercise, and I'll use a dumbbell curl as a perfect example, is in that bottom position, you're going to come up and without pausing at the top, don't pause at the top. You come up as soon as you get roughly to a point where you start to lose, or you don't feel as much tension in the bicep. Don't go all the way up here and squeeze it. Just come up and go right back down into the eccentric. Now, are you going to hurt yourself if you come up and squeeze? And the answer is probably not. Do you like to come up and squeeze at the top because it gives you some psychological benefit, like you're doing something? Yeah, okay, great. Then don't listen to me. Keep doing it at the top. I'm not interested in that part of it. What I'm interested in helping you understand is the physiology part of this. And from a purely physiological perspective, the only thing you may get is a little bit extra, maybe endurance components capabilities here with your muscle in that shortened position. And even that, I don't know I've ever seen any research that speaks to that. But at the end of the day, what I do know is that you want to stay out of that top peak contracted position, get down into where the meat and potatoes are, which is the eccentric or the negative, and then a slight pause, a second in general, but for sure, from a safety perspective, you should do at least a pause. In other words, don't bounce at the bottom and move right into the concentric phase. So you get the idea. Now, from a purely power or strength development perspective, the pause is not always necessary. I would recommend it from a hypertrophic perspective. I would definitely recommend coming down and pausing. Now, that's sort of the athletic side of the house. From a personal training perspective, I have people do pauses for 2 seconds, in some cases 3 seconds, and you're saying, well, that doesn't make sense physiologically. Well, number one, I'm not hurting somebody when they hold in the pause position, number one. The second is that, yeah, there's actually an element of endurance capability and some increased neuromuscular activation that does occur when you hold that lengthened position. There's back and forth on that in the research. I'm not too concerned about it because as long as it's not unsafe, I'm going to do it because I get a better benefit than any of that for my personal training clients, which is psychologically they're doing something different and it hurts a little bit more, right? Because there's an increased tension development component, adds to the fatigue level, and my clients love it because the next workout, I'm not going to pause 3 seconds. I'll pause just momentarily and have them go up into the positive, go right back down. So it looks something like this. These components of the dumbbell curl, for instance. Now, again, although there are 4 components, there's only 3 real tension level components or tension development components, which is the concentric or the positive, right back down into the negative, which is always performed a little bit slower. Generally, there's a safety component to that and tension development aspect as well. And that, so concentric, no pause at the top, no squeezing at the top, right into the eccentric or the negative. And then when I get to that bottom position, boom, that third isometric lengthened stretch position gets a slight or longer pause. Because at the end of the day, pause for a half a second, stop, go back up, or don't. Do 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. You're not hurting my feelings, and you're not hurting your clients. So if you come down, pause, 1, 2, come back up, and then right back down. Now, I know what happens is you get fatigued, and you come up and you go, ooh, and you do a couple more. You're not going to hurt yourself, and you're probably not going to hurt anybody by sitting up here, but you wasted 3 seconds, 4 seconds, and now you've allowed metabolic recovery in your type 2 muscle fibers, which I don't really want to do. But again, you're not hurting your clients, so there's a trade-off. I hope that makes sense. Now, let's look at another exercise where we look at these 4 components, and a great exercise for this would be either dumbbell presses or lateral raises. So let's look at lateral raises, and if we do them a very specific way, we can show that all 4 components, all parts of the repetition, are going to create tension. Of course, the positive and the negative are always going to create tension levels. The issue is always going to be where the change of direction occurs, right? In those potentially isometric contractions. So just as a for instance, if I have my arm at my sides and I'm doing dumbbell lateral raises, lift my arm out to my side, obviously on a deltoid, that's the concentric, muscle is shortening, tension develops. I move up to a certain point. Look, if you're going to go up to here, that's fine. If you go up any higher, yeah, you get some trapezius engagement, but it's not that big of a deal. You maintain a very high level of isometric tension contraction in the deltoid, going even up and further. I'm not saying that's the way to do it. I'm just explaining that you can come up, you get to a point where I think it's pretty obvious that at this point, my deltoids have shortened maximally, and I am now at what's called the peak contraction, i.e. the muscle is as short as it's going to get. Actin and myosin filaments within the sarcomeres, right, within the myofibrils of the muscle cells, bam, they bump up against each other, and you just don't have as many cross-bridge potential now, right? So you're simply not going to develop as much strength and tension. I mean, it's a high level of tension, but the point is that I'm not creating any more tension when I get to this peak contraction, okay? Now, when I let my arm down, I'm maintaining tension because my eccentric provides, right, a certain amount of tension. So now I move on the way down, and now I'm going to get to, depending on where you stop. This is the key. If I go all the way down and drop down here, I've lost tension on my deltoid. It's a waste of time. However, if I come down and pause somewhere where there's still some tension being maintained, I can now reach what's known as the lengthened or the stretch contraction or isometric contraction. So it looks like from here, I can pause. It doesn't matter, pause or not pause. You're not going to hurt anybody by pausing up here. But what I'm trying to get you to understand is that tension, tension, tension. And then if I stop before I get to my side, I'm still maintaining tension. Okay. Whereas with the bicep curl, I got no tension back up here unless I physically flex my bicep. So in an exercise like the lateral raise, I can get tension in all 4 phases. Concentric, eccentric, and the 2 isometrics or the pause positions. Once again, I know what you're saying. I like to come up and pause at the top and hold it. Again, you're not going to hurt anybody, right? There's nothing biomechanically problematic with coming up and holding this position, right? And as far as I can tell, coming down to the bottom position, it's generally going to be related to the maintenance of tension without going down too far. In that case, you can get all 4 components. You will maintain tension throughout each of the repetitions. Now, you could, just like with the bicep curl, for instance, you could come up and not pause, but come right back down and pause for a second or 2 at the bottom, right? And that would be doing something very similar to what I said about the bicep curl. Last exercise would be like something like the squat, okay? And in the squat, for sure, you're only getting 3 tension components in the repetition on a squat. So if I've got the weight on my back, I start in the top position, little to no tension on any of the muscle groups that are involved in the performance of the squat, predominantly the gluteal group and the quadriceps. Of course, the hamstrings are involved, the erector spinae are involved, but the 2 main focused muscle groups are gluteal group and quadriceps. And so think about this. When I'm holding the weight at the top position, I have no tension. But as soon as I lower my body down, that would be technically the eccentric, right? And the muscles, both the quadriceps and the gluteal group, are lengthening, right? As my hips go into hip flexion, that means that my extensor muscles are being stretched, lengthened. The rectus femoris maintains neutral, somewhat neutral lengthening because of the hip flexion component where it shortens, but then I'm at extension at the knee, which is going to lengthen it. The point being that I'm still in the eccentric. And as I lower down, I get to the bottom position, which would be the stretch isometric lengthened position where the muscles have reached, for the most part, their longest or lengthened, most lengthened position. There is a tremendous amount of tension in that bottom position of the squat. From there, I would then go back up. And on my way up, that's considered the positive or the concentric part. Now, those three components, the negative, the stretch isometric, and the concentric, all provide significant amounts of tension until you get up to a certain point. And you all know this because as you get tired on a squat, what do you normally do? You go up and you lock your knees at the top so you can catch a break. And then you do another one and you come back. Well, obviously, that shows you that at the top position, you have no tension. So there is technically no peak contraction. Of course, the only thing you can do, which a lot of folks do, which is potentially dangerous and can create injury, is come up, tuck the butt underneath, and squeeze the gluteal group at the top of a squat. Please don't do that. Please don't do that. If you got a question as to why, I'll do another video completely on some of the silly maneuvers that people do where they're actually creating potential injuries that have no idea. And it doesn't do anything really for you anyway. Again, because squeezing the glutes, for instance, at the top of a squat and going and squeezing, what did you do? You shorten the gluteal group, which we just said has little to no profound effect on either strength, power, maybe a little bit of endurance, but it's just not worth it because you're jacking up the lower back and the lumbar spinal area. But point is that going down, pausing, and then on the way up, the movement part on the way up are going to create tension. Those are the three components. But there is no peak contraction on a squat because generally you're only going to go high as you need to maintain tension, which means you're not locking the knees out. In fact, your knees are fairly bent. A proper squat that maintains appropriate levels of tension on the quadricep and the gluteal group does not have you coming up very high, ladies and gentlemen. It really doesn't. Of course, and you already know this because if you do things like pulse squats, things like that, you feel high levels of fatigue fairly quickly. So those are three exercises that just from an explanatory purpose that I hope helps you to understand this idea of the four parts of the repetition: the positive, the negative. There is a peak contraction either in the lengthened state where the muscle is at the end point of the eccentric before going into the concentric, and or what's known as a peak contraction. Not every exercise has it, but you can do it in certain exercises. And that peak isometric contraction is generally the positional changeover point between the end of the concentric and the beginning of the eccentric, or finishing up the positive, going into the negative. Remember, from a safety perspective, negatives are generally done slow, and you pause as you go from the negative into the stretch contraction or the stretch isometric. It's one of the foundational safety elements of exercise science when it comes to this proper exercise performance. So from a pure safety perspective, that's a critical element to keep in play. Are you going to hurt somebody at the top of a peak contraction? Depends on the exercise as well. So if this video, that's it. But if you got questions, please leave them in the comment section below. It's really important to keep in mind that the goal here is to help you to use the science so that you can get the effective changes in your client from the exercises they're doing without hurting them. Okay, and that is really critical. Please let us know how we can be of assistance in the comment section below. Type the word understand if this made sense to you, right? And you go, okay, well, I got it. Write the word understood And just let us know that it was effective by giving us a thumbs up. By the way, you can share the video with other folks. Nothing wrong with that. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. As always, if you have any questions, we are just a comment. I keep doing this or going like this. We're just a comment away. Please let us know. Have a great week. We'll see you next week. Thanks.